Well, a very warm welcome this afternoon to May's Books and Beverages. And although we're not going to be talking about local history, we're certainly going to be talking about a very important historical figure. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Julian Horrocks, who's probably thinking, what on earth have I let myself in for? But we're kind here, so that's okay. Let me just pass it over to you, really. So what can you tell? You've written about Field Marshal Alanbrooke, as I believe he ended up a very illustrious army career. But what can you tell us about him?
If I start with a very quick skim through his life, his name was Alan Francis Brooke. When he was made a peer in 1945, he took the title Alanbrooke simply by joining his first name to his surname. Quite a military approach to life. He was born in 1883. He was the youngest of 9 children, born to a prominent family based in County Fermanagh, Ireland. So he's yet another famous Irishman who featured in the Second World War, another example being Montgomery. He was commissioned into the Royal Regiment of Artillery in 1902. He fought on the Western Front for the whole of the First World War, emerged from the conflict, having been awarded the Distinguished Service Order twice, mentioned in dispatches 6 times, and promoted to a Lieutenant Colonel. He was married twice in his life. His first marriage was in 1914, and then his first wife died as a result of injuries in a car accident in 1925, and 4 years later, he married his second wife, whose name was Benita. And the war diary, which I'll come on to, the war diary which Alanbrooke maintained throughout the Second World War, was dedicated to Benita. And in effect, he wrote it for her. The 1930s saw him appointed to a wide range of senior commands, and by September 1939, he held the rank of Lieutenant General. In September 1939, he was sent to France to command 2nd Corps, which was part of the British Expeditionary Force. And not widely known is the fact that it was Alanbrooke and his 2nd Corps which played a crucial role in avoiding the BEF being destroyed and enabling it to escape from Dunkirk. After he was evacuated from Dunkirk, he returned to Britain, promptly was appointed Commander-in-Chief of Home Forces, which meant he was the man responsible for fending off any German invasion of Britain. In December 1941, he was appointed Chief of the Imperial General Staff, and as such he became the professional head of the British Army and a member of what's known as the British Chiefs of Staff Committee. And 4 months later, he was appointed chairman of that committee. As a result of those appointments, he effectively became principal military advisor to Winston Churchill and Churchill's cabinet. And he held that position, or held those positions, until the end of the war. He was therefore the most senior staff officer in British Armed Forces, and almost certainly the most important and influential member of the British Armed Forces. The British Chiefs of Staff Committee comprised the professional heads of the Army, the Navy and the Air Force, excuse me, and was in effect the body through which the British government conducted the war. As a result, the British Chiefs of Staff were regular attendees at cabinet meetings and other committee meetings, such as the Defence Committee. So they were right at the heart of the British war government. Alanbrooke was made a Field Marshal in 1944. He retired in 1946, and he died in 1963. He is perhaps best known for his war diary, which he kept throughout the Second World War, which has been published twice before. It was used by the historian Arthur Bryant as the basis for 2 books he wrote in the late 1950s, and then the full unedited version of the diary was published in 2001. And that is a very potted history of Field Marshal Alanbrooke.
Thank you. So he was incredibly important when it came to the actual war effort in Britain in the 1939-45 war.
Yes, very much so.
And he was right in the centre of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was great. So you don't take a different look at him, because you've given a potted history of his military career, which obviously was very, very distinguished. But you've looked at him in quite a different way. So what prompted you to do that?
Well, the 2001 publication of his diary, I read that, and after reading it, I felt there was far more depth and complexity to Alanbrooke, the man, than appears in any other history books. There's quite a well-known and often quoted description of Alanbrooke, which appeared in an article in The Economist magazine in 1957, where he was described as, in his demanding and abrupt efficiency, he knew when to scold, when to encourage, when to protect. Men admired, feared and liked him, and then this add, in that order perhaps. Alanbrooke's chauffeur described him in these terms: "I've never known a greater gentleman. It was obvious the great majority of people were frightened of him." If you take Alanbrooke at face value, he's one of those figures who commands admiration and respect rather than warmth and affection. And in fairness, I think it's correct to say that that is the way historians have approached him ever since 1945. And as I say in the introduction to the book, you don't need to read too deeply to get the impression that actually there's quite a few historians that don't really like him. And he's not, on the face of it, a terribly sort of likeable, warm character. Yet if you read his diary and actually read it closely and analyse it, there's all sorts of contradictions and inconsistencies in his diary entries. And that's what left me, having read it the first time, with the sense there's something more to this man than the historians have tended to paint him out to be. And therefore, that's why the aim of the book is basically to produce a character study of the man, which reveals that depth and complexity. And as a result, I present him in a markedly different and more sympathetic light to the way he's been portrayed. I mean, you might like this one. He acquired a number of nicknames in his life, but the one that's the most humorous was Colonel Shrapnel. And he always referred to behind his back, but he was called Colonel Shrapnel because his approach was forthright and sharp, both in speech and manner. And yet, again, back to research, but if you hunt around trying to find contemporaries' views of Alanbrooke, there's one, I think, absolutely crucial description of him, which was offered by Churchill's doctor, if you've heard of Churchill's doctor, called Lord Moran. And Lord Moran, when he published his controversial book on Churchill in 1966, 67, something like that, he described Alanbrooke in his book as a simple, gentle, selfless soul. And he was a simple, gentle, selfless soul, was Alanbrooke. And one of the things I draw out in the book is to say he really did have an intense dislike of war and thought it was utterly futile. And yet here he is at the top of the military tree, effectively in charge of the British military effort in World War II.
So, hang on. So did you come to like him? Because you've obviously done a great deal of research. Did you find yourself warming to the man? Or did you still find him a bit standoffish and a bit difficult?
Both.
Oh, right. So a real contradictory character.
It's a real contradictory character. And the conclusion I came to is this, he's not a split personality or a dual personality, but there's two sides to him. So you get the professional soldier, the dutiful professional soldier, and But then behind that, as I say, you've got this, in Moran's phrase, simple, gentle, selfless soul. And in fairness, Moran's not the only one. Other people offered clues to this simple, gentle, selfless side of his character. I mean, Montgomery, after the war, in one of the books he wrote, he used the phrase, or he recalled an incident during the war, and then used the phrase, I'll always remember that incident because it was the one moment when I was allowed to see the real Brookie, in Montgomery's language. Another military colleague of his described him as a consummate actor, and yet another contemporary after the war said of Alanbrooke, I am quite sure that he would prefer to be remembered as an ornithologist than a soldier. And he was an avid bird watcher, was Alanbrooke, avid bird watcher. And in the years after the war, he developed a particular skill at bird photography. He became very skilled at that. But he was a naturalist, he loved nature. And so it's often, or not often, but a few times in his diary, in his entries, he records that how appalled he is at the devastation and destruction caused by war and how it destroys his beloved nature. And that always used to upset him.
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, I can see your book in front of me. I'm guessing you've done a lot of research, but what research how did you start your research and where did you go with it?
Well, I started by reading the 2001 publication of his diary, and that wasn't the last time I ended up reading it. But, excuse me, first and foremost, it's the book, or many of the conclusions in the book are based on my detailed analysis of his diary. But in addition, all Alanbrooke's papers are held by the Little Heart Centre for Military Archives down at King's College, London. So there were 4 separate trips for me down to London to go and fight my way through the mountain of papers that are down there. But I mean, it's something I've never done before, but actually it is very revealing, going rooting around in archives, because you dig out all sorts of stuff. So, I mean, maybe I shouldn't say this, but I got a sense from reading around Alanbrooke that maybe his first marriage wasn't the most fabulous marriage in the world, but I had absolutely nothing to base that on. It was just a sort of hunch, sixth sense. You go rooting around in the military archives in King's College, London, and I also rooted around in the archives at Leeds University. These are the files and records of a woman called Marion Long, who was employed as a researcher for a proposed biography of Alanbrooke that was to be written in the 1950s. And her papers are held at Leeds University. But lo and behold, you fight your way through all these boxes of files, and I found one note prepared by Marion Long, marked private and confidential, where in fact Alanbrooke's niece is being interviewed by Marion Long, and she effectively says, yes, it wasn't a terribly successful marriage at all. They were complete opposites. And in fact, I say in the book, I think it probably was an arranged marriage, because Janie was the name of his first wife, and I think Janie's family were neighbours to the Brooke family in County Fermanagh, and they both had a background in the military world.
So it was sort of, they're a good pairing, but actually they weren't. And I understand that the car accident that his wife was in, he was actually driving, is that correct?
That's right.
So that's a real guilt trip, isn't it?
A real guilt trip. And he did suffer from that. I think he managed to get over it. But I mean, the niece in this private and confidential note that I dug out in the archives she said he suffered badly because he did feel absolute guilt at that. And in fairness, it wasn't his fault. The accident was a cyclist pulling out in front of him, but he drove cars very fast, did Field Marshal Alanbrooke.
No speed limits in those days. In fact,
No.
I think you didn't even have to have a driving licence at that point.
I don't think
No, you could just leap in a car and...
1925.
Yeah, gosh. Scary, scary stuff. So what really, what compelled you to write about Alanbrooke? Why did you wake up one morning and think, this is what I'm going to devote my next number of years to? Or was there something that led you into researching his life?
I think it was because I felt I was onto something, that I was painting, as I said earlier, a markedly different and more sympathetic character portrait of the man than had previously been done. And in fairness, that's what sort of kept me going. So to put it in literary agents or publishers' language, there was something new and different about this. And so the odd occasion over the years when I've got so sick to death of writing the book, which as I understand it, an awful lot of authors
It is
do.
not unusual. And I'm looking at some of my fellow writers in the audience who've all suffered.
But it was the one thing that kept me going with it. So, I mean, there was one time I got so sick to death of it, I put it away in the drawer for a year and didn't pull it out, didn't touch it at all. But when I did pull it out, you know, I think I'm onto something here, and it's worth carrying on with. Of course, the danger is that a case of self-delusion, or are you actually right?
Yes. Well, I think that's true of any historian, isn't it? If you're writing or researching into, you know, history or a particular person, you have to always be careful of your own bias, isn't it?
Yeah.
And of course, hindsight is a great thing. We can look back, Second World War, First World War, and see the mistakes that were made on all sides. But they didn't have that benefit, did they? They were in the immediate, unlike us.
A very, very difficult job to do. Again, as his diary shows, because it's Alanbrooke and his fellow chiefs of staff, Dudley Pound, who was the first Sea Lord until his death in '43, and then Charles Portal, who was head of the Air Force staff, he was chief of staff of the Air Force. But these three are turning up at cabinet meetings and just having abuse thrown at them all the time, you know, particularly one defeat after another. So when 1941, late 41, early 42, you've got the defeat in Singapore, and, you know, Churchill, it wasn't just Churchill, just, you know, used to sit there at cabinet meetings and say to these three, you know, have you not got a single general who can win a bloody battle for us? And that's the sort of pressure they were being put under.
And it's interesting because I went to Singapore briefly some years ago, and we were talking to a young man, very young man, who had just finished school. He was waiting to go to university. And we talked about when the Japanese overtook Singapore, and they were taught that the British had deserted them, and they'd let the colony as it was then down very, very badly. And there was a real grudge. All these years later, you know, 60 years after the Japanese invasion, which was so different from how I was taught at school, that Singapore, they just couldn't defend it. And it was a pragmatic decision rather than lose lots of lives. So no doubt your people had those very discussions.
Yes, Alanbrooke was, I think it's accurate to say, his view was very early on, there's no way we're going to be able to defend Singapore, and we'd be better off sending the troops that we sent to Singapore, who promptly ended up prisoners and then packed off to build the railway up in Burma, Thailand, yeah, wherever it was. His view was we'd be better off sending them to Burma, because Burma was the first line of defence for India. and therefore we should have sent them to Rangoon. And in fact, in his autobiographical notes, which he wrote in the 1950s, by way of elaborating on his war diary entries, he does actually say, looking back now, hands up, we made a mistake when we sent the 18th Division to Singapore. We should have sent them to Rangoon.
Sobering stuff, isn't it? And it reminds you, I mean, we tend to think of the great and the good. They're in London, they're away from the front line, although he did fight, as you say, in the First World War. But actually, the weight of responsibility must have been enormous, because you're sending people to their deaths. And you get it wrong, more people go to their deaths. There are no easy answers in wartime.
Yeah, and another facet of Alanbrooke is he was actually a surprisingly sensitive character in all sorts of different ways, but in one of those ways, which comes over in his diary, is he was constantly talking about the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, particularly when he was Commander-in-Chief of Home Forces. And he kept writing endlessly in his entries about saying, look, this weight of responsibility is just wearing me down. Because as far as he was concerned, the plight of Great Britain or the British Islands was in his hands. It was his responsibility.
Which is quite staggering, really. And I know you said you've read his diaries, I'm guessing more than once.
Yeah.
Yeah. So tell us a bit more about these diaries. How honest was he in them? Was this with a view to publication, as often people write now, or was it more getting it all off his chest?
It was getting it more off his chest. His first entry is 28th September 1939, and he starts that entry with a dedication to Benita, his then wife. And he says at the end of the dedication, on no account must this record be ever published. And he largely stayed truthful to that. And when after the war, the Royal Regiment of Artillery decided to publish a biography of him, and they employed this historian, Arthur Bryant, to do it, Alanbrooke agreed to that, but on condition it was only written after his death. So he wasn't in this. He wasn't writing this diary with half an eye on fame and fortune. And in fact, it was Bryant who persuaded him in the 1950s, look, rather than wait until you die and then I start writing your biography, why don't we write a book based on your diary now and publish it now? And Alanbrooke agreed.
Right, and was it successful at the time? Were people interested? Because presumably, although he's faded a bit from history, hasn't he, in a way that Montgomery is still very, very well known, but was there a great interest in his diaries at the time, do you know?
There was, and in fact it got serialised in the Sunday Times. There were 2 volumes written by Bryant. One was Turn of the Tide and the second was Triumph in the West. And the first, and in 1957, Turn of the Tide was published, and that was serialised in the Sunday Times and proved to be controversial. But again, that is not so much down to Alanbrooke, it's more down to the author, Arthur Bryant, because in effect what Arthur Bryant was doing was in writing these 2 books, he was trying to write the record, a slightly misleading record that Churchill had created in his war memoirs, published in the late 40s and the early 50s. And it was a bad move, and what Bryant effectively was doing was saying, no, it wasn't all Churchill who won the Second World War, it was the British Chiefs of Staff. Effectively, he built his books around Alanbrooke's diary and quoted from them endlessly, but he did so in a way, he was very selective in his editing and choice of diary entries, and at the end he sort of ended up painting Alanbrooke as though Alanbrooke was this all-conquering hero and Churchill had absolutely nothing to do with it.
Okay.
Where, in truth, it was the two of them together who pulled it off. But they had battles, endless battles and arguments along the way.
No. So they didn't get on then?
Actually, I think they both respected each other, but it was just endless confrontation and arguments. And one of the things I think that what I seek to draw out in the book is I used the diary in the book because I think the value of his diary hasn't been fully appreciated. There were a great many lessons to learn from Alanbrooke's experiences in World War II, not least being how should a military chief handle his political master. And that's always been a problem area, and it still is a problem area. Now, Alanbrooke came up with a brilliant template as to how to do it, which is meet your confrontational political master with confrontation and just square up to him.
Obviously doesn't believe in peace and tranquility. It must have been awful when they met, especially when they didn't agree, which I'm guessing, strategy, where they were going, what they were doing, perhaps they didn't always get on.
They didn't always get on, but I think it's fair to say they respected one another. Churchill's secretary, can't think of his name now, he described Alanbrooke as being spellbound and exasperated by Churchill, and I think that's spot on. It was all, and again, it's a bit contradictory.
Yes.
Going back to what we were saying, there's a great, if you can bear with me for a few minutes, there's a great section in Alanbrooke's autobiographical notes. I'll read that, sorry, just take 2 minutes.
No, please do.
Brookie is Alanbrooke's another nickname for Alanbrooke. Brookie provided a good illustration of the confrontational nature of his relationship with Churchill, and also his ability to manage and rein in his wayward political master. In his notes, and then I say, note Brookie's mental agility when replying to Churchill's outburst, and what follows is what Alanbrooke wrote in his notes. Winston was by now revolving round the northern end of Sumatra, as he had done over Trondheim in the past. He had discovered with a pair of dividers that we could bomb Singapore from this point, and he had set his heart on going there. It was not a suitable base for further operations against Malaya, but I could not get any definite reply from him as to what he hoped to accomplish from there. When I drew his attention to the fact that when he put his left foot down, he should know where the right foot was going to, he shook his fist in my face, saying, "I do not want any of your long-term projects. They cripple initiative." I agreed that they did hamper initiative, but told him that I could not look upon knowing where our next stop was going as constituting a long-term project. I told him he must know where he was going to which he replied that he did not want to know. All this made arguing impossible.
Sounds like it could be quite good.
Sums it up for him.
Yes, and I know Alanbrooke also wrote, he met a lot of the Americans, people like that. He met Stalin. So is that reflected in his diaries?
Yeah, he comes out with some great character assessments, which I've put a few together here. I'll zip through these very quickly because I'm conscious time's running on. Churchill, in January 1944, he wrote of Churchill, "In all his plans, he lives from hand to mouth. He can never grasp a whole plan, either in its width, i.e. all fronts, or its depth, i.e. long-term projects. His method is entirely opportunist." And on February 1944, Churchill lives for the impulse and for the present, and refuses to look at lateral implications or future commitments. This, I think, is a good one. Alanbrooke identified indecision, particularly in the later stages of the war as another Churchillian weakness. And in July 1944, he wrote, "We met Churchill to discuss Pacific strategy." And this was, I'll keep it brief, Steve. This was, a decision had to be made. Is the British strategy to be focused on Southeast Asia, i.e. Singapore, Malaya, Burma, or should it be based on the Pacific in conjunction with the Americans who were swarming all over the Pacific? We met Churchill to discuss Pacific strategy and settled absolutely nothing. We listened to all his futile and empty arguments, which we have listened to again and again. In the end, I said to him, and he uses quotation marks, "We have examined the two alternatives in great detail. We have provided you with all possible information. We are unanimous on our advice to you as to which course to select, and we are quite clear as to which course we should select. However, we are even clearer still that one or other course must be selected at once and that we cannot go on with this indecision. If the government does not wish to accept our advice, let them say so, but for heaven's sake, let us have a decision."
What a speech.
If you want Stalin, Churchill and Alanbrooke flew to Moscow to meet Stalin in August 1942, and about 10 days later, on the flight back to the UK, Alanbrooke wrote this of Stalin: "A crafty, brilliant, realistic mind, devoid of any sense of human pity or kindness, gives one almost an uncanny feeling to be in his presence, but undoubtedly a big and shrewd brain with clear-cut views as to what he wants and expects to get." And again, back in his autobiographical notes, he wrote of the Tehran conference in late 1943, which was the first meeting between Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt. And he wrote this: "I had already formed a very high idea of Stalin's ability, force of character, and shrewdness, but did not know yet whether he was also a strategist. During this meeting, and all the subsequent ones which we had with Stalin, I rapidly grew to appreciate the fact that he had a military brain of the very highest caliber. Never once in any of his statements did he make any strategic error, nor did he ever fail to appreciate all the implications of a situation with a quick and unerring eye. In this respect, he stood out when compared with his two colleagues. Roosevelt never made any great pretense at being a strategist. Winston, on the other hand, was far more erratic." But he was, he disliked Stalin with a passion, but he rated his ability.
Oh, right. Was there something about that, although he rated him as getting things done is a new phrase, isn't it? Getting stuff done. But actually he was completely ruthless.
Actually?
No. Stalin was completely ruthless.
Yes, completely ruthless.
And I'm guessing Alanbrooke really wasn't underneath it all.
No, he wasn't.
That wasn't his thing, was it? No. He actually cared about his men. Yeah. Whereas Stalin really lose a few thousand, well, what does it matter?
Yeah. I mean, if you want two really short other judgments, Anthony Eden, this is what Alanbrooke said of Anthony Eden. Delightful as he is, in my opinion, he always seems to just miss the point. As for Mountbatten, who he had a very low opinion of Mountbatten. This one's withering, and he wrote this, I think this is about July, August 1945, so we're almost at the end of the war. "Seldom has a supreme commander been more deficient of the main attributes of the supreme commander than Dickie Mountbatten." It doesn't get much more dismissive than that.
Was it a touch of professional jealousy, perhaps? Or was it just they just didn't like him?
Alanbrooke judged people by efficiency. Oh, he was a very objective individual. So, for example, things like nationalism wouldn't come into play at all. The people he rated, which he records in his diary, are people like the South African leader, Jan Smuts, the Polish leader, Sikorski, And in fact, I think the present Polish Foreign Secretary is a grandson, niece, nephew, something of General Sikorski in the Second World War. He rated Stalin, disliked him with a passion, but rated Stalin. Yet Mountbatten was dismissed as useless. Churchill was either brilliant.
On the cusp, you might
on
say.
the cusp. He didn't have many kind words for his fellow Chief of Staff, Dudley Pound, who died in 1943, but in fairness, Pound was ill. That was one of the reasons for it. So he could be as scathing of British commanders, scathing of British army units, yet throughout his diary, it's not endlessly, but there's more than a handful of comments where he praises the German armed forces. He was a big admirer of the German armed forces, and I think that probably harks back to his experiences in World War I. He always rated them.
And kind of sort of moving on a bit from that, why do you think people are still fascinated by World War II, aren't they? It's still just within living memory. Sort of my parents obviously were children during that war, but there are still elderly people who lived through that, either as children or as very young service people. Do you think that's why we're fascinated, or is it because it's such a different time to where we are now?
I think it's probably it's just a cataclysmic event. I mean, it's the scale of the conflict. I mean, it was a global conflict. It's the size of the losses, human losses, both military and civilian. It's a brutality of the conflict, final solution. It's the extent of the damage, destruction, and I think just the upheaval in zillions of people's lives. But I could be wrong here, but I think the Second World War spawned all sorts of other things. So, for example, in Germany, I think this is right, I'm not an expert on the Germans, but the post-war generations of Germans, the Second World War has materially altered their outlook on, what their parents did in the war. And it's affected post-war generations of Germans. I think if you look at the use of the atomic bomb, I think, that probably spawned some of the peace movements that started appearing in the 1960s. But again, you look at the Nuremberg war trials, all the crimes we now hear about genocide, crime against humanity, crimes against waging illegal war, aggressive war, blah, blah, blah. In many ways, these all come back to the Second World War. So it sort of stands there as a monument almost for all time. And because of its effect on people's thinking, how many times do you read a newspaper article and it harks back to, this is the first time this has happened since 1945, blah, blah, blah. So I just think it's a monumental, cataclysmic event.
A massive marker, really, in history, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's like,
better phrase.
Hey, I write occasionally. but it's fascinating, and I think as well as the big figures like Alanbrooke, like Churchill, I think there's also quite a fascination with how people lived at that time. Even if you came from a very wealthy background, like Alanbrooke, how totally different people's lives were in peacetime and in war. We have moved so rapidly, haven't we?
Yeah.
I'm conscious of time, but would you like to just tell us a little bit about your experiences getting published before I pull this to an end?
Yeah, I'll be really brief. I started off...
You've been well briefed here.
I started off on the conventional route. I go and find a literary agent. And I started off compiling a list of agents to approach, i.e. make a submission to. And I broke it down into a primary list. And I have a primary list of 5 agents who really, they were interested in stuff like this. Their website was all about stuff like this. And then there was a secondary list, which are people who, okay, they may not be obsessed about the Second World War or history, but they look a pretty good target to approach. So it was, I think, 5-8 on the primary list, and then 15-20 on the secondary list. I then, by pure chance, I got an entree to one of the literary agents who was on my primary list through a contact of mine who'd done this agent a favour. So the agent owed him back. My friend said, right, you can repay me by dealing with my mate Julian Horrocks. And he was very good, but I had to send a submission to him, and he came back and said no, but he said no because this is a long book, and therefore printing costs are going to be bigger. And that, combined with the fact you're a debut author, means publishers won't touch you. So I then sent a submission to a specialist military history publisher, and in fact it was the boss man who replied to me, and he was very good because instead of just saying sort of no, sod off, I got a sort of 15-line email explaining at some length why he was saying no to me. But the bottom line was, it was the same reason. Nobody's heard of you from Adam, and this is a big book. So sorry, but no. And at that point, I thought, blimey, am I going to spend the next few months of my life drafting these submissions just to be told the same thing time and time again? And that's assuming I even get a reply. And I thought, it's a waste of time, is this? Complete waste of time. I'll just go and self-publish. Because one of the things I realised quite early on with these submissions is, boy, you have got to get them right because you've only got one shot at it. So you've got to get it right, which means it's going to take you hours and hours and hours to tailor. Even if you come up with a submission template, you've still got to tailor it to the individual personal requirements of each specific agent. So I thought, I'm looking at weeks and weeks and weeks. It's easier to write a second book than send 30 bloody submissions off to these people. So I went for the self-publishing route, and I chose a company called Matador, which is the self-publishing arm of a conventional publisher called Troubadour. And they were good. They were good, and it doesn't cost all that much money. Or the base cost that I had to pay them wasn't all that much. The problem with this book was typesetting, but I won't bore you with that unless anybody wants to ask me about typesetting. But the thing I learned from self-publishing is it's all down to you. You don't have that agent or that publisher behind you sort of giving you advice. And Matador, they'd say in an email to me, we've come up with a front cover. We really like this, Julian, this front cover, blah, blah, blah. But they wouldn't advise you as to what to do. And in fact, they're not being paid enough money to advise and take on the risk of, Julian Horrocks turning out to be the author from hell and threatening to sue them and all the rest of it. So I don't blame them for that. But everything's down to you. And the only other issue, just by way of final comment, what size print run do you have? It's the perennial problem of the bigger the print run, the lower the unit cost of the book is to print. Bad example, if the print run was 300 copies, then I'm guessing here, then the individual cost of printing one book would be $11.50, let's say, something like that. Whereas if you print 1,500 copies, 1,000 copies, you probably get the unit cost of that book down to about £8. Now, the problem then is all the time, you've got to be thinking, right, what price am I going to sell this book at? Now, logically, you look at that and you take 25 quid, 30 quid, something like that. But then you've got to factor in all the discounts the book trade wants. And it's not just Amazon who are loitering around at 60%. If gardeners are wanting, the wholesalers are wanting 55%. So you've got your print costs, which have spiked in the last 4 years, i.e. gone up. Then you've got these discounts. So all the time you're looking at, well, where's the money for me in this? And there's precious little of it.
Well, like the rest of us, I mean, that is one of, and I'm sure we could have a whole separate session on the how much authors actually get back from their books. And I've gone through, well, Edwin helped me to self-publish, which meant that I gave him my manuscript and said, can you make it work, please? Which he very kindly did. But, you know, you set up with Amazon, you set up with Kindle, what you actually get seems to bear no relation to what they say. And of course, you say prices have spiked, haven't they, enormously? Amazon have put up their costs, and I suspect it's the same with other book distributors. So it's quite a challenge, and perhaps that's something we can talk about at another time.
Yeah.
I'm conscious of time. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and can we thank Julian for being here?
Thank you.
Does anybody have any questions for him? Yeah.
With regard to your original publishers and the advice you were getting, do you consider rewriting shorter? I mean, I know the issue of editing is often a point of conflict between authors and their growers advising. If you think if they're saying you want to be shorter, I'll do it shorter.
I could have done, but actually, Howard, it's a good point. Editing a diary is not an easy thing to do, and I struggled with it. And of course, not having a clue what I'm doing, because I've never written a book before, you end up leaving in the book, or in the text, the manuscript, far too much of his diary entries. And I was always worried about how big this book was going to be from a very early stage. And of course, the problem is once you're putting in the manuscript, you've got the devil's end job then of saying this has got to come out. And there's another part of you saying, I don't want to take it out. I think it should stay in there. But yes, the short answer is, yeah, I could have written it. It could have been much shorter. But, you know, I still don't think that still wouldn't have made me a fortune. It wouldn't have reduced printing costs.
Absolutely not. Lady behind there, please.
Yeah, you go back to Alanbrooke. Why, if he was like your setups, into the art, surely he was a young man, early 20th century, came to the office with basically a conflict. So he must have known.
Yeah. Well, he was effectively, he was packed off to a cramming school in 1900 when he was 16 years old. And that was his preparation before he was sent on to the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich, I think it's called that. It's a very good question. I should have mentioned this before. He never actually wanted to be a soldier. He wanted to be a doctor, a surgeon, and there's plenty of evidence to support that. And again, back to the point I was telling you about rooting around in archives and what you can dig out.
Alanbrooke had the most ghastly mother, and I sort of second guessed that he may have been encouraged at a minimum to go into the army to maintain the family tradition, and I'd always assumed that it was his ghastly mother who'd pressurised him to do it. And in fact, I found in the archives an interview with Alanbrooke's second wife, Benita, and she says, oh no, it wasn't the mother. The mother supported him in wanting to be a doctor or a surgeon. It was his elder brother who'd gone into the army, and it was Alanbrooke's elder brother who turned his head and persuaded him to enter the army. So the man actually never really wanted to be a soldier. He'd prefer to look at birds.
Gentleman here, thank you.
Being self-published, do I assume you have to self-market?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Can you tell us how you went about it, or how you were going about it?
The main thing was when this is the first print run. I printed off 200 copies of this, because the last thing I wanted was to have too big a print run and then be left with a mountain of books that's got to be pulped, because that's just, you know, money down the drain. But the plan was always, you know, I recognised, look, I'm a debut author, nobody knows me from Adam. The thing I've got to get is reviews. The reviews are absolutely crucial. I'm going nowhere without reviews. So it was, the first print run was small, 200 copies. I left 120 with Matador, so they could sell them into the book trade, to Amazon, and sell them off their own online bookshop. And I had 80 sent up to me here in Harrogate. I'd set up about 30 people to read the book, and then, if they were willing, to give me reviews. So of the 80 sent up to me, I'd sent out at least 30. I think it was probably more that way. And I got about 12, 13 reviews back. And then I used those reviews on the second print run, which again was 200 copies, which I did in October last year, November last year. But apart from that, it's talking, giving talks, and one of the best sources, both for getting book reviews and giving talks, is U3A, because there are so many U3A military history groups dotted around the country. I mean, I'll tell the story against myself. I mean, the principal target market for this book is people interested in military history. Now, that breaks down into all sorts of different types, but it's basically people interested in military history. And it was only purely through accident that I stumbled on a section of that market, which was, of course, guided war tours. And I think I must have stumbled across a website, and the penny suddenly dropped on me. And I thought, my God, I didn't realise. You do a load of research, you think, but hell, there's 60 of these organisations organising war tours, and of course they're all going largely to the same battlegrounds, mainly World War I, World War II in Europe. And I'm thinking, here are people interested in military history. Why didn't I recognise this as a section of the target market? So, for what it's worth, my advice would be, you know, if you're an author and you're having to apply your mind to marketing, which you will have to, think laterally.
As they say, find your tribe.
Find your tribe, yes.
Yes. I can be down with the kids. The gentleman behind you.
I'd like to ask a bit about Singapore. Now, I don't know much about it, but I have heard that there were gun emplacements in Singapore that were very good at firing out to sea, but couldn't turn around.
Yeah, that's right.
And Churchill was scandalised by this when he thought it would make a big difference if the guns could rotate around and fire in.
I don't know about that.
Is that true? Would it have made much of a difference?
Well, it could have done, but I think what probably would have made more of a difference is if the British and Commonwealth troops in Singapore had put up more of a fight. Do you want another quote from Churchill? Are you all right, Sue?
Yeah, we're fine. You've got about 2 seconds left.
2 seconds.
2 seconds
Right.
left. Otherwise, Jane will come and throw us out bodily.
Right.
Which is quite right too.
So, this is Alanbrooke. Right, this is Alanbrooke's 9th February 1942 entry. Finally this evening at 10:45, I was sent for by PM Churchill to assist him in drafting a telegram to Wavell about the defence of Singapore and the need for staffs and commanders to perish at their post. And this was Churchill's brilliant telegram from Churchill. And this is to Wavell, who was in overall command in that of that area. I think you ought to realise the way we view the situation in Singapore. It was reported to the cabinet by the CIGS, that's Alanbrooke, that Percival, he's the British commanding officer in Singapore, has over 100,000 men, of whom 33,000 are British and 17,000 Australian. It is doubtful whether the Japanese have as many in the whole Malay Peninsula. In these circumstances, the defenders must greatly outnumber Japanese forces who have crossed the straits, and in a well-contested battle they should destroy them. There must at this stage be no thought of saving the troops or sparing the population. The battle must be fought to the bitter end at all costs. The 18th Division has a chance to make its name in history. Commanders and senior officers should die with their troops. The honour of the British Empire and of the British Army is at stake. I rely on you to show no mercy to weakness in any form. It is expected that every unit will be brought into close contact with the enemy and fight it out. And then he finishes off, and this is brilliant, Churchill. He was a master of language. I feel sure these words express your own feelings and only send them to you in order to share your burdens.
How kind is all I can say.
Absolutely brilliant. That was to Wavell, General Archie Wavell. Archie Wavell, I can't remember what, no, he'd just been appointed to ABDA, which was a new body set up in December 1941. So he was effectively in charge of the Anglo-American command that he covered Southeast Asia.
So do you think there was a lack of ardour on the part of the...
So
a lack of ardour?
No, the organisation set up was called ABDA.
No, I'm saying you feel the reason you lost Singapore was through a lack of ardour.
Oh, ardour, yeah. I think we could have put up more of a fight, yeah.
But the guns would have helped too, right there, so.
Well, it would have helped knock out, and I don't think they could turn around.
No, if they hadn't been designed that way.
Yeah. No, I mean, the guns wouldn't have come into it. But
No, you don't. No.
don't think so, no.
Anyway, if you want to come and have a chat with Julian afterwards, I'm sure he'd quite happily chat. But ladies and gentlemen, thank you very, very much for coming. Please fill in your forms. It's not for us, it's for the library, because they want to know how much you enjoy these talks. And we look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you.
Thanks very much.